Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The Prime Minister has spent the day speaking to other European leaders and meeting members of her cabinet to discuss the future of her Brexit deal, which was overwhelmingly rejected by MPs earlier this week. Mrs May is due to present new plans to Parliament on Monday. Here's our political correspondent, Ben Wright.
Mr Gove, are you confident of getting the Brexit deal that you want?
So what now? Today, the Prime Minister continued to listen, with cabinet ministers trooping in and out to share their advice with the Prime Minister, who has a Brexit deal the House of Commons hates and the EU insists cannot be changed.
Just got to get into a car.
Tight-lipped. But for Brexiteers, some red lines on trade must stay.
Well, I don't believe we could have an independent trade policy if we stayed in a customs union. And the reason for that is, in a customs union, with the European Union, we would have to apply European trade law without having a say in how it's made.
He's happy to sign agreements with Australia, but he won't sign up to a customs union compromise that might lead to cross-party support in Parliament for a new deal. While some in Theresa May's divided cabinet are telling her that leaving the European Union without a deal would be OK, others, particularly a camp dubbed the Gang of Five, are urging the Prime Minister to find a cross-party solution to this crisis, to compromise and to rule out what they think would be the disaster of a no-deal Brexit. And of course, there's very little time left. On Monday, the Prime Minister will make a statement in the Commons setting out the government's Plan B, and MPs will start to put forward their alternative ideas as amendments to that motion. The following Tuesday, we'll then see a series of crunch votes on all of that. And as things stand, exactly 2 months later, the UK is set to leave the EU, whether Parliament has agreed a Brexit deal or not. The former Foreign Secretary toured a pro-Brexit business this morning, keen to tell the Prime Minister to fundamentally renegotiate her deal with the EU and under no circumstances to delay the UK's departure.
Telling the British public, after all this hoo-ha, that we've abandoned the project of leaving the European Union would be so utterly pathetic. It would reinforce people's view that there's some kind of plot going on at Westminster to stop this thing.
Here, competing ideas to break the political paralysis are being argued over, and many MPs do see the merits in asking for some more time.
If we need further negotiation and Article 50 is extended for a few months, let's say till the summer, then I don't have a problem. Or a few months. And I don't think the public, who are fairly reasonable on this, wouldn't have a problem either.
Before leaving Downing Street for a working weekend, Theresa May spoke to EU leaders, but her headache is here, trapped between the demands of her divided party and a fractured Parliament. Ben Wright, BBC News, Westminster.
Mr Johnson once famously said, "The present age abounds with a race of liars who are content with the consciousness of falsehood." That was Samuel Johnson in 1753. Today, Boris Johnson, no relation, gave a speech on his Brexit ideas. But after falsely claiming he never issued warnings about immigration from Turkey during the referendum campaign, he's been attacked from all sides. Theresa May held more talks with ministers at number 10, but with just 70 days to Brexit, there's no sign of progress. Our political correspondent Michael Crick reports.
As Theresa May grappled in London with what to do next on Brexit, her former Foreign Secretary toured the huge JCB factory in Staffordshire. JCB's boss, Lord Anthony Bamford, is a long-time Tory donor and was a big Brexit donor too. And he says his firm will benefit from Brexit. It was overwhelmingly likely, Boris Johnson said today, that Britain would get a deal, just not Mrs May's deal. And he said Britain should retain some of the divorce bill to get a long-term trade agreement.
To put a tiger in the tank, to incentivise our friends, we should withhold at least half of that £39 billion until that deal is concluded.
But what had been hugely trailed were Johnson's remarks on immigration.
We know the way big corporations have held wages down, some of them, as they've had access to very, very big pools of labour from other countries. Now look, I want you to know, I'm a free market capitalist, and I'm a believer in the benefits of migration, by the way. I think it enriches our country, it brings talent, and it's a tribute to Britain that people want to come here. But I think there's got to be a balance. And if an influx of labour is being used not only to prevent an investment in capital equipment, but also in skills and in the prospects of young people, then we need to think carefully about how we control immigration.
Time to ask about his record on immigration.
Mr. Johnson, haven't you been all over the place on immigration in the last 5 years? 2013, you described yourself as the most pro-immigration politician in Britain. Then we had the referendum.
I think I said roughly the same just now. But anyway.
In 2016, the referendum, you and your chum Dominic Cummings in the Vote Leave campaign suggested 80 million Turks would come to this country if we stayed in the EU, which was absurd then and is absurd now. Doesn't all of this show you'll say anything just to win an election, in this case, the Conservative leadership election?
Well, I didn't say anything about Turkey in the...
Well, that was the campaign you led. Well, that was the Vote Leave campaign you led.
I didn't say anything about Turkey, and I think anybody who's followed my utterances over the last 20 years will know that I'm always been in the camp of those who defend.
So do you disown those remarks then? Do you disown them?
Since I made no remarks, I can't.
No, but your campaign did. The Vote Leave campaign did.
Well, I didn't make any remarks about Turkey.
But do you disown them? You were the leader of the Vote Leave campaign.
You do me too much honour. I was happy to support Leave, and I did. I happen to think that immigration can be a wonderful thing for our country, but as I said time and time again, it's got to be controlled.
Yet Johnson there today was strangely coy about his role in Vote Leave. He, of course, was their big figurehead. He toured regularly on their bus and served on the Vote Leave campaign committee. These are just some of the many different digital ads about Turkey, warning about possible Turkish immigration, which Vote Leave pumped out to millions of voters. Some were part of the £3 million spending blitz which Vote Leave strategist Dominic Cummings organised in the final few days. 4 times today, Johnson told me he'd said nothing about Turkey during the referendum. But the Channel 4 News fact-check team quickly found that is just not true. Take these TV debates.
And this map shows in red Turkey, but the only countries named in this map are Syria and Iraq. That's scaremongering, Boris, and you should be ashamed.
All right, Gisa. It's government policy. It's government policy. As far as I know, last time I looked, the government wants to accelerate Turkish membership.
EU. We should be, I think, outside the EU, and I think Turkey.
Do you want Turkey in?
Provided we come out.
Oh, well, there we have it.
I'm all in.
It was the scheme.
I'm all in favour of Turkey coming in, but I want us to come out.
At one point, Johnson and Michael Gove wrote this letter to David Cameron about Turkey. The public will draw the reasonable conclusion that the only way to avoid having common borders with Turkey, they wrote, is to vote leave and take back control. Johnson himself has Turkish ancestry, and earlier in the referendum, the press quoted him as saying, "I am very pro-Turkish, but what I certainly can't imagine is a situation in which 77 million of my fellow Turks and those of Turkish origin can come here without any checks at all. That is mad. That won't work." After Johnson's Q&A today, I tried to put that quote to him.
Now here you are, Mr. Johnson. April the 17th, you said, "I'm very pro-Turkish, but what I certainly can't imagine is a situation in which 77 million of my fellow Turks and those of Turkish origin can come here without any checks at all." You said, "This is mad, that won't work." You said it was mad, Mr. Johnson.
It was perhaps not the best way to end what some saw as Boris Johnson's latest leadership bid.
Well, meanwhile, Theresa May in Downing Street has continued her meetings to try and resolve the Brexit crisis, not with opposition politicians today, and certainly not with Jeremy Corbyn, but with Conservative colleagues, mainly
pro-Brexit Conservative colleagues, Ian Duncan-Smith, Michael Gove, Jeremy Hunt, Chris Grayling and Sajid Javid among them. Not so far as we know with anybody from the Conservatives who's in favour of a second referendum. There have also been many reports today of civil servants preparing for a possible snap election. Boris Johnson in Staffordshire today said he thought that was a very bad idea, and Mrs May's spokesman said that that was not going to happen, that the next election wouldn't be until the due date of 2022. But I suppose, given what happened 2 years ago, that's about as reliable as a football club chairman voicing full confidence in the team manager.
Thanks, Michael. Well, at the end of a tumultuous week, what do voters in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland make of the chaos at Westminster and the tortuous Brexit progress? A new group, Right to Vote, which is campaigning for a second referendum, has carried out a survey which found 69% of voters in Scotland think Brexit would make Scottish independence more likely within 10 years. Almost 2/3 of those polled in Northern Ireland thought that Brexit made a united Ireland more likely in the same time frame. But in Leave supporting Wales, just over 1/3 thought that Brexit would see it sever its ties with the UK. Well, one of the founding members of this new lobby group, Right to Vote, is the Conservative MP Sam Gyimah, and he joins me now from Surrey. Why can't you just join people's votes? Isn't that what you want? Why have you got this new group on the right?
Well, this group was founded by my colleague, Dr. Philip Lee, to make the Conservative case for a second referendum. If the deadlock in Parliament persists and there are no other alternatives, what we are saying is that we shouldn't close the door on a second referendum to let the people back in the process to have a final say on Brexit.
Now, you heard Boris Johnson today making his pitch for leadership, and you'll have heard our explanation of why what he said was completely untrue. What do you make of it? And would you stay in the Conservative Party if he were to become the next leader? Dominic Griever said he'd leave.
Look, I'm not really interested in commenting on hypotheticals, but also Boris Johnson. I think part of the issue with this whole Brexit saga is there's so much focus on personalities, when actually what the people need are to hear the trade-offs, the difficulties, the challenges in delivering Brexit. I mean, you mentioned the poll at the top of this programme about Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales. And what that tells us, and I think that is what is important...
Yeah, but you've got to meet Boris Johnson somewhere in the middle, haven't you?
As a united kingdom.
I mean, the point is you've got to be able to agree with Boris Johnson at the end of the day what Britain's going to do. So, you know, what talks have you had that suggest any
Boris
kind
Johnson
of...
on what?
Well, that's what I'm asking you. You know, can you agree with him on anything? Can there be any compromise? What have you said today to the Chief Whip and others in your talks?
Right, OK, if you want to talk about cross-party talks, I fear that I do not see a compromise coming out of them. The reason for that is that the government has not made an offer to people who've got different views. Instead, what seems to be happening is the talks are a process for which the government wants to reiterate its existing position. But the government's deal went down to a historic defeat. So what you've got is you've got these so-called talks, which have turned into an elaborate lobbying exercise over cups of coffee. So you've got Theresa May, who is not listening. She hasn't made a big offer. There is no clear process. And you've got Jeremy Corbyn, who's saying he wouldn't talk without preconditions. So I do not see this as a recipe for producing consensus in Parliament, which is what we need. Now, it is not surprising at some level because there is deadlock. And why is there deadlock? There is deadlock because we have a hung Parliament. There is deadlock because there are many different flavours of Brexit.
Well, let's come to how we break the deadlock. I mean, do you agree with some of your colleagues who are saying MPs now need to take control of what happens in Parliament, that you should now have the right to lay down legislation, take that away from the government? If that proposal is put to Parliament next week, will you back it?
Yeah, I think there needs to be a much stronger role for Parliament to contribute to the Brexit process. And the reason for that is there is no deal that can pass through Parliament purely on Conservative votes. Any deal that gets through Parliament will have to be on a cross-party basis. And that means that the government has got to let Parliament in and give Parliament a greater say in motions and how things are discussed. And that's because also the Prime Minister is caught between two different tribes in her own party, irreconcilable tribes. Some people who think that no deal is absolutely fine, and those who think that a soft Brexit is where we should be going. So given that the Prime Minister can't satisfy these irreconcilable tribes with any action she takes, I think allowing Parliament to have a greater say in the process to enable a cross-party consensus is a sensible thing to do. But ultimately, whatever decision comes out of this process, the government would have to implement it.
Sam Gyimah, thank you very much.
Now, as the Prime Minister attempts to grapple behind the scenes to find a way forward on Brexit, Boris Johnson burst into public before the cameras today to criticise her efforts. Judged by many to be another barely concealed bid for leadership, he said she should simply go back to Brussels and tell them to drop the controversial backstop for Northern Ireland. But he was quickly enmired in a controversy of his own about claims he'd made during the original Brexit campaign.
While Theresa May was taking soundings in London about what to do next over Brexit, Boris Johnson was making a noisy intervention of his own. No longer Foreign Secretary, but still a VIP at JCB's headquarters, he had this advice for the Prime Minister.
If we spend the next few weeks hydraulically straining to move MPs from one camp to the other, or pointlessly trying to get Mr Corbyn to come and parley at number 10, we'll be wasting our time.
His solution, demand Brussels dump the backstop.
We haven't even tried to get rid of it. We haven't even asked.
Mr Johnson, you're standing in front of a giant digger. Wouldn't it be more appropriate if you're standing in front of a giant unicorn, suggesting that simply going back to Brussels and saying, get rid of the backstop, they are going to move on this? And isn't it a bit rich suggesting that Theresa May hasn't even tried to negotiate with Brussels when you abandoned the field of play when you resigned as Foreign Secretary?
Fair question. I think I tried to answer it in my speech. Actually, this is the moment, and I don't think we've gone in with sufficient drive and JCB-style gumption to get this.
Today, in what looked like a rebranding exercise, he also said he was pro-immigration. How did that sit, he was asked, with his claims during the referendum that millions of Turks would come to Britain if we stayed in the EU?
I didn't say a thing about Turkey, and I didn't make any remarks about Turkey.
Didn't say anything. A brief glance at the record, this letter to David Cameron, for example, suggests otherwise. But what of his claims that Mrs May, who headed to Chequers this afternoon, would get nowhere with cross-party talks? One former minister thinks he's right.
I fear that the talks are doomed to failure because the Prime Minister is highly constrained. She's got irreconcilable demands on her in the Conservative Party, but also the Prime Minister is very wedded to her own deal.
But the reality is her deal was sunk this week by a massive majority, and she only has until Monday to come up with Plan B.
Anne Levy joins me here in the studio. So let's talk about the Plan B on Monday. How is that all going to unfold? To take us through it.
Well, Boris Johnson today described the Prime Minister's deal as deceased, and you would think after that crushing defeat on Tuesday that in fact it was dead. But all the signs are, despite all the talking that's been going on in Westminster in the last 48 hours, all the signs are that her Plan B that she presents to the House of Commons on Monday will look incredibly like Plan A, perhaps only in different coloured ink. The reason being is that she's walking a political tightrope. Some of her cabinet apparently threatening to walk if she says that she won't consider taking no deal off the table. Others saying they'll walk if she embraces Labour's idea of staying in a permanent customs union. I think what might unlock the situation is this backbench amendment put forward by Jack Dromey from the Labour Party, Caroline Spellman from the Conservatives, which is demanding that the government take no deal off the table. How could they do that in practice? Well, perhaps extend Article 50. We won't know whether that is going to happen at all until the week after next, because the actual vote won't be till Tuesday the 29th.
So yet another crunch day on the way on Monday,
Absolutely.
Libby. Thank you very much indeed for that.
It's been quite a week. Faced with deep national crisis, Parliament has entered a looking-glass world in which a critical mass of members know what they're against, but can't quite agree about what they're for. And having reasserted the power of the Commons, they've challenged Theresa May to come up with another plan, by Monday no less, that they'll vote on in 11 days' time. If you've had enough of Brexit, fear not, we'll be discussing the latest revelations about Donald Trump a little later. But first, David Grossman has been examining what might happen in the next few days as the Prime Minister tries to escape the Brexit rabbit hole.
Coming for the Downing Street rubbish, which presumably this week includes a few hundred copies of the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement. It was, after all, comprehensively trashed by MPs on Tuesday. The distance between Downing Street and Parliament can, with the following wind, be covered in a couple of minutes. But politically, they are now hundreds of miles apart.
This is the back door into Parliament. In truth, Theresa May hasn't even begun to bridge the modest distance between here and just over there. Today, she spent her time meeting cabinet ministers, trying to square them away, trying to get a consensus around her cabinet table as to what to do next.
Did she succeed? Well, ministers weren't saying very much.
How was that meeting today?
Hello there.
Can I ask you, what was discussed?
Just got to get into the car.
How did it
Hello.
go?
Hello.
We'll take that as a no. Someone who was speaking, though, today was former Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson at the JCB factory in Staffordshire. He told the Prime Minister to go back to Brussels and demand changes to the deal, particularly the Northern Ireland backstop.
Whatever our friends and partners are saying now, I think they will be flexible. Because if you follow the way the EU works, I can tell you that it's only in the last few days and weeks of a negotiation that the big concessions are really made.
And for that reason, Mr Johnson said it would be quite wrong to try to extend Article 50 beyond the end of March.
All this vacuous talk of extending Article 50 is dishonest, but of course it's also weakening our negotiating position once again.
So what happens next? Well, on Monday, the Prime Minister has to come back to the Commons and explain to MPs exactly what she's going to do next.
Do we expect her to have a fully formed plan by then?
I don't see how that can be the case. I think it's going to be a statement of the talk she plans to undertake and the way she plans to go back to Europe and to ask for a renegotiation. But what it opens up is the possibility of other parliamentarians tabling amendments to that motion saying, we're not happy with this as a new plan, we want you to have another referendum, or we want you to do something differently in terms of the outcome you should be aiming at.
And those new amendments telling the government to do something different will be voted on the 29th of January. But even if passed, they won't have the force of law.
Order.
As we saw this week, Parliament can vote down government laws, but as things stand, they can't initiate new ones without government agreement. This is the tangle of wires and pipes under Parliament, much of it out of date and redundant. A radical plan by backbenchers would allow MPs to initiate a law to prevent a no-deal Brexit.
We are rewiring the relationship between Parliament and government, rewiring the constitution, if you like. It's happening before our very eyes, but it is a great example of how Parliament is now having to step in and take control. The Prime Minister doesn't need it to be this way. If she came to Parliament on Monday with a clear compromise around the Norway solution, Common Market 2.0, I think this radical rewiring of the constitution wouldn't be required. But drastic times require drastic measures, and if that's what we have to do, then that is what we will do.
Would be a very unusual step for this to happen. Procedurally, it's entirely possible, and some people have been very worried about this possibility. I think the backbenchers' concerned seem to want it to be a very time-limited thing, but obviously if you do it once, there's always a possibility you could do it again.
The Prime Minister left Downing Street this afternoon, heading for Chequers and more meetings over the weekend. Her mission right now looks pretty impossible.
That was David Grossman. Well, let's unpack this week's momentous events and see where we might end up by Monday. And to guide us through, we've got Tobias Ellwood, the Defence Minister, joining us from Bournemouth. Green MP Caroline Lucas, she met with the PM to discuss Brexit this week and is coming to us from Brighton. And here with us in the studio, we've got Caroline Slowcock, formerly Private Secretary to Margaret Thatcher and John Major and author of People Like Us, and Anand Giridharadas, whose book Winners Take All looks at the spreading backlash against the global elite. He's also been trying to make sense of our political crisis this week and was in Parliament for the Prime Minister's defeat on Tuesday. Tobias Ellwood, if I could start with you. You've got 101 issues, from the veterans ones that you look after in your own department to all sorts of other government issues you'd rather be getting on with. When do you think business might get back to normal?
Well, you make a really important point. The world is changing fast and it's getting more dangerous, and we see a shutdown in the United States, the Gilets jaunes issues in France. These are Western nations that need to be working together, as the Secretary General of the United Nations has called for, to deal with the multinational problems that affect us. And it's not only just climate change, it's migration moves, but it's also resurgent nations such as China and Russia. These are important things that Britain participates in. So the sooner that we're able to land a Brexit deal, the sooner we can get back to focusing on these international issues.
And do you think the Prime Minister has a plan to do so? Or is this still, frankly, in free fall in constitutional and political terms?
It was very clear that the government's plan was defeated, heavily defeated, and she's put out the olive branch to say, let's talk, let's discuss. Let's everybody take a step back from the anchored positions that we've had. It was defeated not because there was one big idea waiting in the sidelines, but because it was a coalition of convenience of lots of separate ideas. What she is doing now is to reach out to ask everybody, is there some centre ground? Is there a place of compromise that we can all step towards in order to honour the referendum result?
Caroline Lucas, you were one of the people called in for this open door discussion. You looked the Prime Minister in the eye. Do you think she's got what it takes to listen to the other parties and to make a new departure, to craft something that maybe departs from some of her existing red lines and gets a withdrawal agreement across the line, as it were?
Well, sadly, no, I don't think she does. She's reached out to the rest of Parliament far too late, 2.5 years too late. She certainly won't rule out no deal, and as long as no deal is hanging over us, then I think that poisons the discussions. It's pretty much as if she's blackmailing MPs, hoping to run down the clock by forcing them, trying to force them to accept her deal, because that's better than the famous crashing out with no deal. And she's still within her cage of red lines. I mean, I asked her point blank, you know, what is it that you would be willing to look at yourself and potentially change? And answer came there none. So I think it is positively delusional, really, to think that some kind of eureka moment was going to come out of those discussions with MPs over the last 24 to 48 hours. What I think she has to do is to recognise the scale of the defeat that she's suffered. It wasn't just, 20 or 30. She went down by 230 votes. That means she needs to completely change direction. And I can only see the way forward being that she puts her deal not to Parliament where it's gridlocked, but back to the people, with Remain as the alternative on the ballot paper. I can't see any other way of getting any kind of resolution on this.
And briefly, Caroline Lucas, before we'll move on into some of the other aspects of this, but do you think that, given what you've said about her reluctance to rule out no deal, Parliament will move on Monday to take the necessary steps to take control of business and to try and put down a resolution that actually formally prevents the government from doing that?
Yes, I do. I think what you're going to see in the next few days is basically Parliament moving into the vacuum that's being created by, unfortunately, two party leaders, the two big party leaders, who neither of them are able at this moment to exercise any kind of leadership. So yes, Parliament will be stepping up, will be filling that void, and will absolutely be looking at ways of taking back control and making sure that somehow we move forward out of the mess that's in front of us.
And Tobias Selwood, do you agree with some of your ministerial colleagues who've been arguing that this no-deal thing has to be kept there as part of the British position, or would you accept that that's just the way things are going and it's inevitably going to be up for discussion?
I don't agree that it's just the way things are going. Let's be clear, the no deal is there and being discussed because it's the default position that we spiral to if nothing else changes. So when we say get no deal off the table, no deal is the table. It's what's left when there's nothing else there. And it requires good people to step forward, including the Green Party, all these parties, to say, let's not keep ourselves in the position that we're in before, but is there that place of compromise that we can all step towards to see whether Parliament can agree something, if there is consensus, and move forward. And that's exactly what the Prime Minister is doing. Of course, she will not reveal at any particular meeting exactly what her plans are. She'll take stock listening to voices right across the piece. Let's wait to hear what she has to say on Monday.
And briefly, do you think she is prepared to surrender some of her red lines in that context?
Well, I think all parties need to recognise that we were defeated. If we are going to move this forward, this needs to happen. If we fail to do this, we do head towards a no deal situation. And for many reasons, that would be unacceptable. It would be actually an act of self-harm, in my view. But ultimately, you can't avoid it. We're contingency planning for it, because if nothing else happens, if there is gridlock, you end up with no deal. I hope there'll be a positive attitude that all groups will move forward and see whether we can actually land something which is that compromise.
Anand Giridharadas, you were there. I mean, look, you're watching this you're watching this as someone who didn't grow up in this country, who's an outsider to our politics in many ways. What did you make of it? What do you make of the situation that Parliament now finds itself in?
I was here on an innocent book tour, and when I planned my Brentrance this week, I didn't expect that it would be one of the most dramatic political weeks in this country. Through a former friend of mine who is now in Parliament, I was able to be there Tuesday night. And what was so interesting about it to me as an American who follows every news alert in our drama across the ocean, it was like when you have a family fight in your family and then you go to your cousin's house and you realize they're having a slightly different family fight with words like backstop, but it's sort of the same fight. It was an argument, as I could understand it and process it with my lens, about whether people want to be part of the world or want to close off from it. And it was not lost on me that while the government is shut down in the United States because of a fantasy of a wall, it seemed to me we were having an argument in the House of Commons about turning the English Channel into a seawall. And although some people voted this way and some people voted that, the testimonies of pain that a lot of the MPs spoke about in their 3-minute speeches about what was actually happening in their constituencies, whether they were on the left or right, actually had a deep commonality that also reminds me of America. Stories of people basically fearful of their kids' fortunes, fearful that their way of life is under threat, people who can't see more than 2 or 3 feet ahead of them. So I think even as we get into the nitty-gritty of this politics or of the latest Trump-Mueller developments, I think what we're living through in a broader way, as I think about it, is a kind of global no-confidence vote against a ruling class that has failed to deliver bright futures to hundreds of millions of people in this era.
That's a huge issue. Caroline Slocott, you lived through Mrs. Thatcher's final days as she was engulfed by crisis. Is it a completely different paradigm today, as Anand suggests? So are politics so different and so energised by these forces, populists and other forces? Or do you see common elements in the way that Theresa May is having to face up to this crisis?
Well, I think that
like or loathe her, and I wasn't a political supporter, I think Margaret Thatcher was in tune with a certain kind of zeitgeist, and she set a vision which people responded to. And I think now we're in a situation where politicians haven't been able to carry the people, and you know, I don't see that Theresa May is the person myself who can actually manage to reach out and provide that consensus that would enable politicians to actually do it for the people.
Do you have sympathy for her predicament as a politician, having been inside Downing Street during this?
Well, I mean, I think like a lot of people, yes. I mean, I think it's interesting to see the kind of parallels between the two women. You know, I didn't vote for Margaret Thatcher, but I did feel sympathy for her when the end came. And, you know, part of that was that she didn't see it coming, and there was a kind of human sympathy that that I felt for her. And that's, you know, a bit of what my book is about. For Theresa May, actually, I do feel less sympathy. I mean, I think, you know, I recognise similar things. You know, I think both women, in a sense, took on the jobs the men wouldn't do, the difficult jobs. They're on a glass ceiling. There are similarities, I think, in that the difficult journey that they've had through life, through discrimination, has led them to be particularly determined, particularly courageous, you know, particularly focused on the job and trying to get the job done, completer finishers. But in this particular moment, this is a disastrous set of qualities for Theresa May. Maybe she will change in the next few days and create this national consensus, but I doubt it. You know, I think it's probably time for her to move aside, and the only people who are going to do it are going to be her cabinet colleagues.
Caroline Lucas, sorry, can I just ask you on this one? Yeah, go ahead, Tobias.
Well, can I just say, I think this would have tested any Prime Minister. This has been an age-old question of our relationship with the European Union. It's been there for decades. It was put in a referendum where the question was a little opaque. What does leave mean? Even today, I get different questions or encouragement to interpret leave this way or that way or another. We're in a coalition with a party that happens to have the only land border with the EU, and we're in a minority government. This would test any Prime Minister. The resilience, the determination the Prime Minister has shown and her fortitude has been exemplary. It requires all of us now to be consensual, to recognise Parliament is now in control of this. If we want to honour the referendum result, we all need to move forward and find that space of compromise.
Caroline Lucas, do you have any sympathy for the Prime Minister, or do you agree with Caroline Slowcock that in a sense she's part of the problem now and needs to step aside? Or do you think, no, actually at this particular moment she does have to see it through?
I think we need to be careful what we wish for. If she were to step aside, then we may well end up with Boris Johnson or Michael Gove, and neither of those, I think, would be very helpful. But I want to go back to something that Anand said, because I think he's absolutely right when he was drawing attention to the speeches that MPs were making in the chamber earlier this week, because what they were talking about, what we were all talking about, was very little about the EU and everything about how the UK is governed. So my point would be that, in a sense, we're trying to answer the wrong question. The big question really is around the political and democratic crisis in our own country, the grotesque inequalities, the injustice, the insecurities, which I think led so many people to vote leave in the first place. No one is actually trying to address those underlying concerns that I think was so instrumental in that leave vote. So until we start to do some of that, and we could do that perhaps through things like citizens' assemblies and other kind of engagement with the wider public, we're not going to actually get to the heart of what's at the problem here.
Briefly, do you think that this generation of politicians in Parliament now that you've seen have the necessary equipment politically and in every other way to deal with this populist challenge of this moment?
With the caveat that my exposure here is less than in my home country, I have to say, watching on Tuesday night, the opposition leader and then the Prime Minister give their competing speeches on one of the most important nights for this country in any of our lifetimes, it seemed to me, to be totally honest, that it was a competition of two people, each trying to be the more uninspiring avatar of the 1970s. And I don't say that dismissively of your country, because we have the same problem in mine. In a moment of pain, of angst, of fear, whether it's left or right, I think we're missing a kind of upstream moment that is resulting in these downstream crises. People are afraid. People can't see who they're going to be in the future. And instead of speaking vividly, powerfully, emotively to people, none of the good leaders, whether it's a May or a Corbyn or Donald Trump in the United States, are speaking to that and leading it into, sorry, I didn't mean to call Donald Trump a good leader, but are leading that to good places. They're either flat or they're connecting with people and using that for evil, as I believe Donald Trump is in my country.
Well, Anand, you've mentioned Trump, and that's all we've got time for on this particular discussion.